Hey guys, so I guess this is going to be the first online lesson, so I guess we'll go right into it. So the first thing we need to do is open up a compiler. So the one we use is GDB Online Java Compiler. So if you look it up, it'll be the first option. So if you don't know, a compiler is basically something that reads your code and does something with it, right? So if you were to open up, for example, a notepad and type in some code, right? Nothing would happen because there's no way to run it, right? This notepad doesn't know its code, so it doesn't do anything. And that's why we use a compiler here. So today we're going to be talking about um, outputting text to the screen from the computer, and then we're going to go into variables. So the very first thing is how do we output something? How do we get the computer to output something and have the user read it? So right here, we already have some code inside of the public static void main method, which we'll talk about later. We have system.out.println hello world. So what this is basically telling the computer to do is to print out whatever is inside of these parentheses and inside of these quotation marks. So if you just run the default code, let's see what happens. So it gave us hello world. So now if we wanted to change what was inside of here, let's change it to I like coding, right? And then if we run it again, we can see that whatever was outputted here changed, right? If we said something like apples, right? Same thing, it changed to whatever you put inside of here. Um, so that was pretty basic, but something else that you can do in the code is simple operations, right? So we have things like addition, subtraction, division, which is this little slash, and multiplication, which is a little asterisk thing. So let's do something basic. Let's try 1 plus 1. So since we didn't put quotation marks around it, right? If we put quotation marks around something, it means we'll print it out exactly how it is, right? Because it's a string. And we'll talk more about that later. But for now, if we add these two together and run it, it'll give us 2. Let's try something else. Let's do 3 times 9. So if we run it, that should give us 27, right? How about something like 64 divided by 8? Right, we run it, and that gives us 8. So feel free to pause the video here and maybe try something out on your own, right? Just do some simple operations. Maybe do something more complicated. So 64 divided by 8 plus 3, right? And that should give us 11. Cool. So that was outputting something to the screen. So now let's talk about variables. So if you've taken a math class, you've probably learned about variables before, right? You can have x equals 45. And what x is basically a placeholder, right? So if you do something like x plus 56, right? You know it's not going to be the letter x add 56. It's going to be the number 45, right? X is a placeholder for 45, and you add these two together. So in Java and other programming languages, variables work in a similar way, except with these, they can store other things, right? Like text or other more complicated things that we'll talk about later. So in order to create a variable, the first thing you have to do is give it a type, right? So today we're going to talk about integers, right? So 1, 3, any number without a decimal point. We'll talk about doubles. So that would be something like pi, right? 2.14, or anything with the decimal point. So if we did 3 point whatever, right? That would be a double. And the last thing we're going to talk about today are strings. So a string is a text like we were doing earlier. So string hello world, right? Something like that. So the first thing to do is create a variable type. So let's say integer, right? We want to give it a number. And then the next thing to do is give it a variable name, right? So earlier when we are talking about x equals 45, the variable name would be x, right? Since that's the placeholder for whatever we're putting inside of it. So let's go back int, let's call it my age equals 16. So what this is doing is saying that my age is going to be a placeholder for an integer, right? And the integer that we're putting here is 16. If you wanted to change it, we could put 9, right? So my age would represent 9. So let's go back to 16. And now what we can do with this is we can display it to the screen. So let's do what we did earlier, system.out.println, right? And instead of saying 16 like we would have earlier, like that, instead we're going to give it the variable name. So we're going to say my age. And let's run it and see what happens. Right, so it printed out 16 because that's what my age is a placeholder for. If we wanted to change this to 10, right, and we run it, it would give us 10. So notice how we didn't put quotation marks around this, right? When we put quotation marks around something, it's going to print it out exactly how it is, right? So if you put quotation marks around my age and we run it, it's going to print out my age instead of 10, right? That's because when we do it without parentheses, it's going to be looking for integers or variable names, right? So if we put quotation marks around it, it's not looking for the variable name. And even if we type it the exact same way, it won't recognize it as a placeholder for 10, and it'll just print it out. Now let's go over some of the other variable types. So we already did an integer. Let's do a double. So let's say double pi equals 3.14. And now let's create a string. I'll call it my name equals Lucas. And now, like we talked about earlier, right, we have to do the type, then we do the variable name, and then whatever it's going to be a placeholder for. And notice here how when we did string, we have to capitalize it. So since Java is case sensitive, that means if you don't capitalize it, it'll give you an error. So make sure you capitalize string. And also notice here when we put in the text, we put it in quotation marks because we want it to be a string, right? We want to read exactly what's here. And the last thing, notice how we end every line with a semicolon. So a semicolon in Java is kind of like a period, right? Java needs to know when to end the line, right? We can put multiple of these in a single line, and it would still work because we have semicolons, right? So it still worked. But if we were to put them in separate lines without semicolons, right, it wouldn't know when to stop, so it would keep looking, and it would be like a run-on sentence, right? So it would give us an error because it is expecting semicolons. So now let's do something a little bit more complicated. Let's get it to print out some text and then also print out some of those things. So let's do system.out.println, and let's say my age is, right? Actually, we're gonna do something different this time. So instead of system.out.println, something else you can do is system.out.print, right? And we'll see what it does in a second. So let's say system.out.print my age is. So another system.out.print my age. So let's run it. And notice how all this printed on one line. So the difference between system.out.println and system.out.print is when you do system.out.println, let's do it here, it'll print just this text on a single line and then it'll go to the next one. So for example, if you run this, you see that my age is, and then 10 will be on the next line. So let's go ahead and just complete this. So go back to print. And then let's just say system.out.print pi is, and then do system.out.println pi, right? And we'll run it again. Great. So another way that we can get all of these on a single line is something called concatenation. And basically what that is when you, here, let's just write it out, system.out.println. So we have a string, right? My name is, right? Since it's text, it's going to be a string. And then we want it to say whatever is inside of this variable name, right? So what we can do is use a plus here and then do my name. So this plus here right? It's different from when you do numbers, right? When you have numbers in an operation, it'll add them together. So 1 plus 1 equals 2. 2 plus 3 equals 5. However, here, if we do it with two strings, let's just run it and see what happens. Oops, we forgot a semicolon. So as you can see here, what it did was it took this string and then it took this string and it placed them right next to each other exactly how they were. And this also works with numbers, right? So let's say my name is my age, and it took this number, let's see, and placed it right next to it. So that's all for today. We learned about printing things out to the screen using system.out.println, right? System.out.print. And then we learned about variables. So int, right? This is the variable type, variable name, and what it's a placeholder for, right? We have doubles, which are decimals, and we have strings, which are just text. So in the next lesson, we'll be learning about taking in user input using a scanner.